Hello, everyone. I'd like to talk with you about transparency in the most basic terms. To begin, how do you define transparency? Why is it essential to respect human rights, and what are its dimensions? In other words, can you measure or mark transparency objectively? And to conclude, two questions. Do others outside of Electronics Watch use transparently differently? Where do you start? Well, let's go to the dictionary. Transparent means visible through something, understood or detected, evident, obvious, clear. So supply chain transparency means to make visible through the supply chain itself, the conditions in factories, mines, and fields, and ultimately, it's about the visibility of workers. Everyone in this room is committed to the welfare of electronics workers, the chemicals they're exposed to, compliance with local safety, wage and hour laws, and enjoyment of core labor rights. But also, every institution in this room purchases more than electronics. If you purchase seafood from the South China Sea, you're exposed to slave labor. If you purchase uniforms or other apparel, it's a factory environment that has many of the same labor abuses as the electronics sector. So if the goal is respect for human rights, it's a widely held objective in civil society that transparency is the route to the end. In the words of the UN Guidelines on Business and Human Rights, it's important to know and show your supply chains. You can only manage what you know. Without it, you don't have the capacity to manage your supply chain. And if you don't show your supply chain, there's no reputation risk, which is often the root of accountability. Over the past year, I've studied 20 different transparency initiatives, which I've organized into these 6 categories, many of which are designed to promote upward harmonization, that is, to pick out the best practices of transparency and spread them across entire sectors, or perhaps multiple sectors. So the good news is there's a lot of innovation going on, a lot of experiments and evolution. The bad news is that this can be quite confusing. There's different language, there are different methodologies, and sometimes the objectives are conflicting with each other. Just to give 2 examples. United States law, the Transparency Act of 2006, should be the most progressive transparency law in the world. Congress mandated the executive branch to make US government supply chains transparent through all tiers, and yet the executive branch implemented the act only with respect to transparency of the corporate identity of the supplier and the particular goods being purchased. California's Transparency in Supply Chains Act of 2010 has supply chain in the name of the act and transparency, but there's no transparency of the supply chain required. Instead, it's a law that says, tell us what you do. It's about company policies designed to promote compliance with human rights. So the result is a set of transparency tools and language that's complex and hard to define. The challenges are that it's hard to compare and learn, it's hard to choose best practice, and it's hard to harmonize up. And moreover, the risks are that the market can be confused, and there's a high chance of faux transparency. In other words, companies can talk a good game, but they put out information that's really not transparency. It's just information. And there's also a risk of false claims. In other words, companies claim to be respecting human rights when in fact they have no idea what's going on in their supply chains. So to bring some order to this, I'm suggesting that we look at transparency for respecting human rights in 2 very obvious dimensions. The first is depth of supply chain, which begins with a prime contract and then works through tier 1 factories where the final goods are produced and tier 2 factories where the components are produced, and then lower tiers where the materials are supplied to the tier 2 factories. The other dimension is stage of disclosure, or what human rights lawyers like to call stages of due diligence. So look at column 1, you see buyer and supplier policy. That's like the California Act, which has been copied in the Modern Slavery Act, Article 54. Column 2 is supplier identification, the corporate identity, including the beneficial owner of a corporation and procurement volume. Column 3 is specific location of production. I highlight this because it's often a gap in transparency. Many companies feel that they are at a competitive disadvantage if they disclose their exact supply chain. And this also happens to be where many companies balk in order to avoid accountability. Column 4 is working conditions. So for example, Electronics Watch focuses on conditions of reporting prior compliance, in other words, previous audits, the chemical inventory of a factory, and trading conditions from the brand on down, for example, conditions like delivery dates that might actually exacerbate human rights problems. And column 5 is remedy, both plans for remedy and actual remedies. So let's move on to my concluding points. Are other organizations using transparently differently? Well, we can pick out a few of those initiatives that I talked about and see how they compare. The Modern Slavery Act focuses on just 1 out of the 5, buyer and supplier policy. As important as that is, it's actually pre-transparency in terms of the supply chain. These are enabling policies, not supply chain transparency itself. The US Transparency Act provides information, but only on supplier identity and procurement volume for a particular set of products. European Union also has a database called TED. It's much more cumbersome and provides similar but incomplete information compared to the US model. The Fair Labor Association began with apparel and is now working in the electronics sector with Apple as one of its participants. The FLA sought out to provide reports on audits for particular brands so that the working conditions are transparent vis-a-vis the audit, as are the remedy plans. The hitch there is that the specific location of production is not provided. The FLA provides the country of production, but not the specific factory, so there's a gap there that would impair accountability for that particular factory. How does Electronics Watch stack up compared to these other models? Well, as you can see, Electronics Watch covers all 5 bases. It has a strong code of conduct in implementing policies, including the supplier guidelines. And then it covers all of the actual stages of supply chain transparency, but I've noted this in a different color blue to signify that this is transparency to the ultimate government purchaser as distinct from the public. So Electronics Watch may not have the same impact in terms of reputation risk that some of the other models might have, and yet it is comprehensive. And just to note, Electronics Watch is evolving quickly, and it really hasn't had an opportunity to develop its full strategy for transparency yet. So stay tuned. I think good things are to come. If you take that same table and flip it over and look at the negative aspect, you'll see what the gaps look like. And so it becomes more clear from this view that for some of the transparency initiatives, there's more gap than there is transparency. So what lesson do you take from this? I'd say be skeptical. Understand that people are using the word transparency to describe very different things. Different innovations come from different initiatives, but they don't cover the same territory. So if your government or your organization are just starting out and you want to be transparent beyond the scope of Electronics Watch, where do you start? That's the question I get most frequently. The answer is fairly clear here. You start with the prime contract, where you have privity of contract to require the buyer to provide its own code of conduct and standards in comparison to that which your own government or institution is using. Secondly, be transparent with respect to whom you're doing business with, and provide the public with information about the procurement volume for your suppliers. And then for at least your tier 1 factories, through that supply chain, require disclosure of the location of production. That would enable unions and third-party monitors, such as Electronics Watch, but others in other sectors, to hold the supply chain accountable. So there you have it, a basic definition, a template for where to start, and a roadmap for the future stages of your progress on transparency. It's been great talking with you. So long.